Who are you?
I am a lawyer. I'm a public defender. One person who I was super obsessed with was Jane Goodall children who were 13, 14 years old and would sit in the chairs when their legs didn't even touch the ground.
The principles of punishment.
In order for somebody to feel better, we need to punish them.
Your college dorm experience.
During school hours, you have to be clothed, but like in the evenings, it's okay for you to be nude. If you pick every battle, then you're really picking no battle.
What's it like to win a court case?
Our job is a job of losing.
Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Hope Cassella. Hope is a Los Angeles County public defender who I first had the privilege of meeting at Lightning in a Bottle, a music festival in California. And throughout this 5-day experience, amongst the partying and dancing and music and chaos that exists at a festival, we would often sit down and just have these really deep, beautiful conversations. And I knew immediately that Hope was somebody I had to have on this podcast. She is undoubtedly one of the most intelligent, compassionate, and thoughtful people I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. And I'm so grateful to share her with you. In this episode, we cover her experience of being a public defender in Los Angeles and how she came to that decision to do that. We talk about her experience as a tutor in a juvenile correctional facility, the challenges she faces with the criminal and justice system in our current day and age, ways to solve them, as well as her love and fascination with Jane Goodall and the influence that her work has greatly had on Hope's perspective in life and the way that she approaches basically everything, but especially healing and important, impactful, sustainable change that we want to create in our lives. If you are somebody who's deeply interested in the world around us, as well as ourselves, our internal world, you're going to love this episode. There is so much depth to this conversation. It's deeply empathetic and thoughtful, and I hope that you learn, if nothing else, the importance of kindness and realize just how connected we all actually are. And without further ado, here is Getting to Know Hope Cassella. Who are you?
Oh, can I curse on your podcast?
Absolutely, you can curse on my podcast.
Okay, sweet. So my name is Hope. I am a lawyer. I'm a public defender. I work in Los Angeles County, and I am a human who's doing her best, trying to be a good human and trying to help other humans and other non-humans and just trying to be the best version of what I think existence is meant to be. And sometimes doing great at it and sometimes doing abysmally at it. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Beautiful. You mentioned that it's your goal to be a good human. Like, how do you define like what being a good human is for yourself?
I think that it's like a super fluid definition, and I think that there's never one singular like set of words or like a definition I would come up with. I think that sometimes I would define it based on like when I make a decision, what are the things that are guiding that decision? So if I am, kind of at like a crossroads and I have to decide, something with a case, I ask myself, what factors am I leaning on that are influencing the outcome of the case, right? So I think that one pattern that I've noticed when I'm trying to make a decision is I try to think about, am I trying to make a decision to benefit me first and foremost, or am I trying to make a decision to benefit the collective? And if I'm trying to make a decision to benefit the collective, whether that be a group of clients, a group of people, a community, a family, where do my interests factor into that decision if my priority is the collective, and do they factor in? So I think that finding the right balance of like, how can I make decisions and live my life in a way that is going to kind of give and like express an awareness or show an awareness of kind of like our fundamental interconnectedness. And I think a decision that contemplates and prioritizes others around me and their benefit and their interests is if crafted the right way, a decision that will also benefit me equally in some indirect or direct way. And I think that's because of how fundamentally connected we all are, humans, non-humans, everyone. So I think, to like kind of put that more succinctly, I guess being a good human in the most abstract way I can think about it, and it plays out case by case. I think that being a good human is is trying to hold a continual awareness of that, and trying to make decisions and live your life in contemplation of that, or doing your best to. I think that's what I
Yeah.
would say.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. I'm curious when you talk about the that interconnected piece, and that's a big piece of it for me. Is there is that sense that we are all connected. I forget if you and I have talked about this idea before, but I have this like kind of a bit of a joke, but I also believe it's true in its own sense of like the idea of math being wrong, right? And like understanding that
Yeah,
math,
yeah,
like
yeah.
one
We did
plus
talk about
one.
this.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. So like one plus one is, two, but like you can't ever really have two of any actual things. Like you have two fish, but those fish can be slightly different and they're not actually the same. So like math works to like in its own framework and with groupings and these different things. It's a great tool, but we can't mix it with reality, right? When we understand that like the air between you and I, even at this far distance, is all still this sort of large interconnected thing.
Mm.
We start to realize our place in it isn't separate from all this stuff, but we're all connected. I actually just interviewed his name's the Naked Pastor on Instagram, and he's a kind of a
Awesome.
deconstructed Christian. Yeah, he does a lot of really cool art about that process, and he had a saying something to the effect of, words are what separate us. Because that's what we use to categorize things, right? That where we have like a fundamental connectedness, but then we talk, we separate, we categorize, and all of a sudden there's you and me versus just us or this like larger unspokenable thing.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, and like understanding like your individual self in relation to that like
Mm-hmm.
collective thing, your place in it, where do you start and end, and is there a start and an end to any of it? And like, and I think it's also the most persuasive argument for self-care for people who tend to be more selfless. If you
Mm-hmm.
understand that you are a part of something larger, and that larger thing is the thing that you tend to prioritize, but you are also a part of it, it's actually selfless to also take care of
Mm-hmm.
yourself, because that fundamentally impacts everything else around you too. So I
Yeah.
love that. That sounds like an interesting interview.
Yeah, it was awesome. Which, if you're listening to this, make sure to check out that one. But one of the things that you said that I thought was brilliant was that aspect of when you're doing something for someone else, understanding that that's going to come back around to you. And on the other
Mm,
side of what you just said, where like when you're taking care of yourself, you're taking care of the collective, right? Because I think so many people can see this dichotomy of, oh, I'm either going to take care of myself, and if you want to like put it on the sort of political spectrum, right, you have like then the high Republican part of like looking out for myself, like hyper independence and hyper responsibility, or you have like
mm-hmm,
the very liberal extremism side where it's like, oh no, we got to take care of everybody else, but like I can't have any money, I have to be broke, or I can't like
mm-hmm,
do anything good for me. That's a very selfish thing. And yet, like, to your point, like you're like, oh no, like these things are deeply interwoven. And understanding that, like, I guess I'm curious, like how did you get to that place yourself, because it's not an easy place for very many people to get to at all.
you know I'm not sure if there was, I think a lot of it kind of just trickled in different experiences I've had in my life, and I agree with exactly what you're saying. I love that kind of like questioning or saying that this binary of like, individualism, like hyper individualism, or like hyper collectivism, for lack of a better term
Mm-hmm.
to describe it, like these two things are not diametrically opposed as our political system would lead us to believe, and as our like two main political parties would lead us to believe. They're actually one and the same. And people who internalize an identity one way or another at the expense, or in this like us versus them mentality, I think are really missing out on a lot. And I think it limits us in a lot of ways. So I mean, I think I don't know how. I don't think there was like one like light bulb moment that like led me to have that perspective. I think that we all kind of know this, and it's just a matter of like seeing things or having interactions and being given the space and the freedom to kind of remember it. I think that we all kind of start off knowing this sort of general principle and concept, which is why I believe it very strongly and I feel it very strongly. And I think we all sort of know it, and it takes different things and different triggers, multiple triggers throughout our lives to sort of like re-remember or re-recognize what I think we all at our core know. And different like environments that people are born into, different walks of life, different cultures, different hardships, different lack of hardships. All of these things I think can pose unique barriers to getting back to that. And I think it's yeah, everyone has like a unique way of getting back there, or they can get back there if they choose to be open to it, or if the opportunity presents itself. So I don't know if there's any one like book I read or like one experience that I had. I think like there's just sort of this like, yeah, that makes sense, when little inklings of that concept was presented to me in various places. I would just be like, yeah, that feels like it feels like common sense. It kind of feels like gravity. So I guess reflecting now, because that's a very interesting question. I guess reflecting now, the one like specific, like grounding it in like something a little more specific, like one of the first times I remember like kind of reflecting on it was when I was younger. I was in, I think, fifth or sixth grade, and I was like nature animal kid through and through, super obsessed with, I was just learning about factory farming. I'd recently become a vegetarian. I was in that whole rabbit hole, getting into like my angsty teenager phase where everything, I was like, the world is such a dark place and there's so much suffering, and like we all, I was starting to wear my black eyeliner. Like I was just getting into that, maybe like 12 years old. And one person who I was super obsessed with was Jane Goodall, the person who at a very young age went to Tanzania, studied chimpanzee behavior, and learned about how similar chimpanzees are to humans, and really had us collectively question the definition of what it means to be human, because there were all of these like very specific definitions that uh, anthropologists and different people, archaeologists had as to what defined human. And she went and studied these chimps and realized chimps do a lot of these things. They use tools, they have community, they have some early semblances of religion and spirituality. So we have all these definitions that chimpanzees are now a part of. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a chimpanzee or non-human? So she started to, as she grew and like, went on with her life, and was like, shit, chimpanzees are endangered. Shit, there's a poor community of humans that they are living near. And that poor community of humans is understandably chopping down the trees and, participating in deforestation in order to create farmland to feed their families. Like, super understandable. We can't vilify anyone for that, right? So she wrote in a lot of her books about this idea of like, if you want to change something or solve an issue or address an issue in a meaningful way, you have to consider the interconnectedness of the different entities involved. And the way that Jane Goodall broke it up, and I became so kind of like fixated and very attached to this separation. She was like, there's always a human interest or angle, there's an animal interest or angle, and then there's an environmental interest or angle to every issue that you can think of. And when you're trying to find a way to address the problem, you have to look at all three because they all inform one another. And so I think at that young age, that concept of, again, like inherent interconnectedness of everything was introduced to me, and it really just resonated with me. And I think that is one of the like things that I really delved into and was very attracted to, that helped me remember that. And so she started these organizations called Roots and Shoots, and I started my own little chapter when I was like I was like 12 years old at my little Catholic school, and I was like, okay, you guys, we have to like do a project for people, and we have to do a project for animals, and we have to do a project to help the environment. We have to make sure we do all three, because that's the only way that it's going to matter. And so that was like a thing that I was trying to like espouse at my school. And I think like from there, like that was sort of like one of the seeds that I like consciously remember being planted and being like, oh, this is how you participate in holistic change, and this is how you do advocacy or activism in a way that truly, I think, calls for or like calls in sustainable solutions, and is not so singularly focused that you're trying to solve one problem by creating more harm in other areas, right? Because that doesn't work out. So I think upon reflection, that's like one of the ways in which I consciously remember thinking about this idea of interconnectedness. And then it just sort of spiraled from there.
Yeah, no. So it sounds like from what I'm hearing, it was reading Jane Goodall at a young age, and that influence on you in your life and her
Mm-hmm.
words. Like, what drew you to Jane Goodall's work in the first place at quite a young age? Because that was definitely not part of my high school reading material.
I was a weird kid. I've always been kind of like a weird kid. I think I've always loved animals. That's always been like a huge thing for me. I think it's also why I became very curious about food and the concept of eating meat and the concept of consuming animals at such a young age, because the realization of like, oh my gosh, when I'm eating this piece of chicken, like that piece of chicken was once like this being who could breathe and who could feel pain and who had emotions, and now I'm just eating it, and it's going to give me a few minutes of pleasure, a few little bit of dopamine, and then maybe a few hours of energy. But that is an entire life. That's an entire existence. And I became very like almost freaked out by that when I was a kid. It like freaked me out because I was like, this doesn't feel good to me. And it made me very sad. And I think like having this like being so drawn to and very interested deeply in like the experience of non-humans. Like, what is it like to not be human? What does it feel like to exist and to be a non-human? I was thinking about that all the time with my dog. I was thinking about that with the animals that kind of came into my space of like, what is it like to exist in this kind of form? Like their brains are so different. They can't do this thing that we can do, but they can do this other thing. And so like, what is it like to experience consciousness from this very different mind and this very different body? And like, I became very like drawn to that. And through there, I started reading books about people who studied animal behavior, and Jane Goodall was the one that I really loved the most, because she was not just about studying animals and studying chimps, but then she kind of turned it into a mission, and then she turned it into action, right? She wasn't just purely a scientist. She turned it into like this whole movement. And I really just loved that. I thought that that was really cool.
Yeah, you talked about that earlier about her level of activism. Basically, I'm going to shortchange it, but basically, like being effective activism, right? Not just protesting for protesting's sake, or
Right.
creating a change that is very short sighted, or, like to your point, causing more harm with just violence begets violence, and that those different types of ideas, right? It's actually creating something meaningful and sustainable, which I think is something that we don't think about often, and it's something that I coach my business clients on. Even is like the
Mm,
importance of like prioritizing like sustainability first, because if it's not sustainable, it doesn't really matter if you can build it, because you won't be able to
hmm.
last. You won't be able to keep doing it. You have to understand like all of these really big changes, like whether it's fitness or whether it's your business or relationships, right? These things are going to be like a forever game. There's not really a point
Yeah.
where you get off the treadmill at some point. And so you have
Yeah.
to do something that like you can do in and every day, and it's got to be something that can be
Hmm.
persuasive to a lot of people and manage. I'm curious, what did
Yeah.
you learn about activism from her that like impacted you into like how you see it? Like how do you create that type of sustainable change in activism?
You know, I think that it's the challenge is that, right? It's like you take this kind of very, I don't want to say idealistic, aspirational, I guess I'll say. You take this very aspirational framework of like the way that we try to instill change should contemplate all of these different entities and interests. Um, and then finding a way to plug that into the current situation and environment and issues of our time and place is fucking hard. It's
Yeah.
really hard. And so I think finding, and I think that the danger that I've run into in my personal like kind of journey with this is when I was a teenager and I couldn't find ways to sort of do it in the ideal way that I wanted to, I just sort of became frustrated, and I kind of just was like, well, fuck all of this, So I would kind of go through these periods of like, I have this very idealistic way that I would like to effectuate change, but there's no conceivable way for me to do it. I can't really garner the interest that I want to garner because everyone is so wrapped up in themselves and in their own lives and their own problems, understandably so. And then I would also get caught up in that when I was going through whatever I was going through as a teenager. And it would be frustrating because I would be like, there's this knowing in a vacuum or in theory of like how we should be approaching social change, but then grounding it in the specific issues of Los Angeles County is hard. And I'm not sure that I know what that looks like. And I try to do it in little kind of like micro ways, smaller ways in my job and in my life. But in terms of trying to effectuate that on a larger or more sustainable level, I think it's hard. And learning when to kind of like use what you have with what you can. Is that the do what you can with what you have? I said it backwards. Do what you can with what you have. Like, when do you sort of just revert to that, even if it's not perfect, but at least you're doing something to try to create a world that really is for everyone, sustainably so. And so that's sort of the journey that I'm on right now, like with my job, which is, I can't imagine doing anything else. And at the same time, there are so many obnoxious limitations to what my job can do for people. And yet I feel like it's the correct place for me to be because it's also one of the only places where the specific kind of impact that I want to have can be had. So it's this really weird paradox that I'm in, where I'm in a job that severely limits me in terms of my idealistic type of change that I'd like to effectuate. But it's also, while it's not idealistic in its content, it's the most impactful thing I have ever done. But the flavor of the impact isn't exactly how I'd like it to be. So I'm in this place right now where I'm sacrificing like the idealistic way I'd like to change things in favor of like a greater impact. And it's interesting. I don't know if it's right, wrong, or indifferent. I don't know if those concepts are even real, but like, I don't, but that's kind of where I'm at with it. I think it's fucking hard to take an idealistic concept and ground it in the very, very complicated issues of a community that is wrought with bureaucracy, that's wrought with, stale infrastructure and apathy. I think it's fucking hard. And I don't know if I've figured out how to do it. So if you can like figure that out, Cam, and let me know, I would really appreciate it. So like,
if I can figure that out, I will let you know 100%.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to delegate that to you.
Perfect. I will get working on it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it kind of circles into a question I was thinking about anyway, which was, with all of the various things that matter to you, you have gone on so many different journeys, I'm sure intellectually and what you could do with your life in all of these different places. And through all of that, you have chosen to be a Los Angeles County public defender. Why is that for you, for right now, like the most impactful thing that you can do?
Great question. It's a question that I and a lot of my colleagues who are kind of similarly minded to me ask and talk about often. And it's so the way that I got into or interested in this job started, I guess, in college. I was originally going to be, or wanted to be, and thought I was going to be a documentary filmmaker because at that time I was still, I had a mind toward like, there's so many issues in the world. There's so much suffering. This world, this place, this existence can be so much better if we do, if we find a way to like address X, Y, and Z issue. So I had a mind toward that, and I was exploring like, well, how can I have the most impact? And at the time when I was, I guess 18 is when you could start college. When I was 18, I was like, it's documentaries, film is the language that I want to use to try to like create mass awareness about issues. Because for me, the name of the game at the time was awareness. People need to know about XYZ issue, reproductive rights, animal rights, whatever the fuck, climate change, name your issue, right? People need to know about it. And we need to find a way to effectively tell as many people as possible about the issue. And if everybody knows about it, I had this belief that that would be enough to at least catalyze some sort of change. But first, people need to know, and they need to be given ways to know it in a very like digestible and like accessible way. And for whatever reason, that's film and movies more than it is books. So I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be a documentary filmmaker. I was taking film classes, and I took screenwriting, and I took all like the basic classes that you take in college. And I was good at it, but I wasn't great at it. I never was winning any film festival contests. I was never like, the standout. I didn't have the eye that a lot of my classmates had. And I was like so jealous. I was like, damn, like I wish that I could just, see a vision and like, have like a cinematography instinct like some of my classmates do. And I just did not. I like just didn't, no matter how hard I tried. So I created stuff that was fine, but it was not gonna like elevate or like catalyze the masses. It was hard for me to watch sometimes. So I was always like just like a normal person in those classes, and I liked it, but I knew that it was not something that I had like a knack for, which was very humbling.
Yeah.
And I took at one point, just to get some extra credit, extra units. I needed more units for that one particular semester, and I took a constitutional law class. And when I was in that class, I felt very different, because in that class, the way that I was learning that you think about the law, that you think about analysis and argument and rhetoric and all these things, like it came very naturally to me, and it felt easy and very like correct. And I was flagged as someone who was good at this and who stood out in that class. And I really enjoyed the debates. I really enjoyed being able to be in a space where you just kind of share perspectives. And I was like, oh, this might be a thing where I can have a bigger impact, because I'm better at it, and I'm a big, big, big proponent of playing to your strengths. So love film, love documentaries, but like that's when I started to like shift a little bit, and people were telling me and reflecting to me like, this is, this is where you should, run with. This is the thing that you should run with more than the other thing. And I'm grateful
Mm-hmm.
that I had people who cared about me enough to reflect that to me. And I'm also grateful that I was in a space to like receive it and not be like, fuck you, like I'm gonna be an artist. Like you don't know me, which I very likely could have done if I was in a different headspace. But I was just like, I could have doubled down and tried even harder to be like a mediocre documentary filmmaker, um, just to like fucking prove it to other people. But for whatever reason, and I don't really know what it was about that time and space when people were reflecting that to me, that I was like, yeah, I should probably like maybe think about doing something else. Like it feels good to be good at something. It feels good to be great at something. And I was also like enjoying what that felt like. So I was like, okay, maybe lawyer. What kind of lawyer? I don't know. Civil rights, criminal defense was honestly like not on my radar. And then I saw this volunteer opportunity to volunteer at Juvenile Hall, over in San Bernardino, to tutor kids who were incarcerated to who were going to take the GED, which is what you get when you don't graduate high school, but you get like that kind of somewhat similarly situated degree. So
Mm-hmm.
that when they get out, they can be eligible for various types of employment. So I got to see what a jail facility looked like for the first time, and a jail facility filled with children who were, who were inmates, but who were also like as young as 13, 14 years old, and would sit in the chairs while I was tutoring them, and their legs didn't even touch the ground, because they were
Wow.
so short and so small. And yet they were in these like prison jumpsuits, basically, or like, the function, whatever similar thing that they were wearing. They were inmates, they were incarcerated. And I remember being so disturbed by that and just so like impacted by seeing kids like in these like literally just being treated as so subhuman and so just completely dehumanized at such a young age. It really like haunted me. And I got to like know these kids, and I got to like form connections with them, and I like got to learn about their lives, and I quickly realized like, shit, like if I was born into any semblance of circumstances that these kids were born into, like I absolutely could be here too. And that's true for literally any of us. Like these kids,
Mhm.
like, you know, are not monsters, they're not super predators. They're literally just kids who were dealt a shitty hand in life. And what kind of shitty hand is complicated, right? And there's a bunch of different type flavors of that. But for the grace of God, right? Like that could be any of us. You know,
Mhm.
if the situation, if the circumstances were just a little bit different, right? And in a parallel universe, maybe that is me or maybe that is you or whatever. So
Yeah.
it was very like haunting to realize that, and to realize like, and to kind of witness the what almost seems like irreversible damage that is done when you put someone in a cage. And I was seeing that on steroids because they were children.
Mhm.
So then that got me into like a whole rabbit hole about criminal justice system, incarceration. I read Angela Davis's Our Prisons Obsolete because I was like, we really should find a better way to do this because this is fundamentally fucked up, right? Like this is
Mhm.
fundamentally not making anybody better. I became very interested in the principles of punishment. Like, why do we feel the need to punish when there's been harm done? Like, why is that our instinct? Um, why was it our instinct? And more importantly, why does that continue to be our instinct in our current society?
Mhm.
Like, why do we feel this need for retaliation and to, like, quote unquote, balance the scales? It seemed. Um, it seemed archaic to me the more I thought about it. It seemed fundamentally backwards and not helpful to the collective. And I became interested in the idea of like, well, when somebody has been harmed, when somebody is a victim, like why is there this collective assumption that in order for that person to feel whole, somebody else has to hurt? Like why is somebody's healing contingent on somebody else's pain? And I came to realize that, or believe that, it's actually not. They're two entirely different things. And the fact
Mhm.
that we are sold this narrative that they are connected, I think really regresses us as a society. So I thought, okay, well, I'll get into like policy and litigation and stuff like that. And I did a couple of internships pre law school at like civil rights type organizations, not necessarily incarceration centered, but just civil rights in general, and wanted to kind of get my way into like the ACLU or something like that, the American Civil Liberties Union. And I really was missing that feeling that I had when I was with those kids in the jail. And I was like, I need to like work with the people who are affected by this. Like, I don't want to be, it's not for me. And it's an important position for people to have, but it just didn't light me up and it didn't fuel me to be in this ivory tower somewhere else working on, legislation for this theoretical idea of change when I wasn't grounded in the people who were experiencing it every day. So I kind of just felt pulled to a occupation where I could work with the people who are affected by this system. And I kind of came to believe that in order to effectuate any kind of large scale change, you need to be, we call it, in the trenches. You need to be in the trenches, and you need to be deeply and intimately connected with the human experience of the worst and most failed parts of our system. And public being a public defender is, in my biased opinion, the best way to do that, because you are experiencing humanity at it in its like in every possible form you can imagine. You're experiencing victims at the height of their trauma. You're experiencing people who have done harm because they are victims, and victims who are re-victimizing themselves because they've, people who are projecting. There's just like this confluence of all of these really complex parts of human nature that come through when you work in the criminal system. And when you work in the criminal system, like representing people who are disenfranchised. And I think like this job has allowed me to learn about humanity in a way that, in my biased opinion, no other job can. So I guess this very long soliloquy has led me to believe that it's the very unique window into the human experience that has like led me to believe that being a public defender is like the best thing that I could be doing right now.
Beautiful. God, I have so many like thoughts after all of that. I guess where I want to start would be when you were seeing those kids in juvenile hall and the image that you painted, even just in your brief like synopsis of that, was so harrowing to me, right? To think of like the kids whose feet don't touch the ground. Like, what was that? What was it like for you to be in a space where you're seeing all these kids and kind of walking into space and going, oh, like, because I think a lot of times we can hear like, oh, juvenile detention, that kid's going into juvenile detention. We can kind of like throw it into this like bubble, and we don't really have any experience of what that is like. And for you to talk about like, kids in an actual prison is a totally different image than we would normally think about. So can you like just
Mm-hmm.
dive in and share more about that experience for us?
Yeah, I mean, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. And like, I remember you would have to get up kind of early in the morning. I think it was on Friday mornings we would go, and we would take this little van to the San Bernardino Juvenile Correctional Facility. Um, and we would have our like little, there would be like a stack of like GED study guides and books. And I forgot, I don't know if we had to buy them ourselves, but we had to obtain study materials to bring to these kids. And I remember the first couple of times I went, like I got to, for the first time, and now it's so normal to me because I experience it every day in my job, but I got to experience like how there's like all of these little subtle things about being in a carceral system that just breeds isolation and makes everyone so apathetic and feel so disconnected from each other. So, you go in, you have to go through a million doors that are like locked. You have to go through one door, the door behind you locks, then you're like in a little area. And then that you have to go through another area. You have to go through metal detectors. You have to like, you have to show me your ID and let me make sure we know who you are. Like put your arms out, like let me wand you with a little metal wand thing. Like there's like all of these weird things that you go through. And it's just so like clinical, I guess, for
Hmm.
lack of a better word. It's just so depersonalizing, and you just feel like you are a number there. And that was the experience I had not being an inmate there. That's an experience that I had just going in there to try to have an interaction with these kids, but I wasn't even the one being vilified. And I already felt so dehumanized just by being there. And that's like, and I'm not even the one who's the target of the dehumanization, but just by being in the vicinity of
Yeah.
it, just by working in it, it was like so strange and it felt so unnatural.
Hmm.
And I remember going into like the room where the kids sit, and it's literally like right outside their cells, which are these like small rooms with bunk beds and like a little metal toilet in the corner that, there's no privacy. And then there's like a bench, these like little tiny thin mattresses bunked on top of each other, really no extra space, a like metal toilet bowl like in the corner,
Hmm.
and like benches, like a little bench to sit on, and fluorescent lights overhead at each of their cells. And then they come out and they sit at these big round tables, and they sit with us, and they just kind of are expected to learn and study for the GED with these college kids who may or may not know how to be effective tutors, but just the fact that somebody is willing to sit with them and talk with them and like do something with them was above and beyond what they were getting day to day. And I remember the thing that I was really interested in at the time, because I came from a very like rigorous academic background. So this was so like this was so jarring for me. I remember like asking them like, well, what is your day-to-day like? Do you go to school here? Like are there teachers? And the consensus was, well, no, like we don't really go to school. Like we sit here and they pass out workbooks, and then they kind of just say, do your work. That's the education that these kids are getting. Like there's no
Wow.
teacher who's going up and teaching them a lesson. Nobody gives a shit if they do or don't do their work. Nobody gives a shit if they're learning, if they are doing anything. Um, and then on top of that, like there's just there was no investment in like how these kids were spending their time in there, because the priority was that they were, able to be put aside and just not dealt with, and their issues not dealt with, so that the rest of the community could just not have to deal with them. And that was the vibe that I was really getting. And so that's why like the program I participated in, to like go in there and like actually like speak with them and work with them, was like such a deviation. It was kind of like, I kind of felt like it was the thing that the institution had to like make themselves feel okay about how much they were neglecting these kids. Like, oh, we have the reach program, so it's fine. But it's like we were going there once a week for I think maybe 2 or 3 hours, to like sit with them and like try to help them study. But like honestly, like when I tried to help them like substantively with the material, like really all they wanted to do was talk and have a conversation. And so like there wasn't, it's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like how can you expect someone to sit down and like learn, I don't know. What do you learn in high school? Algebra? Like,
Algebra.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, whatever shit that you learn in high school. Like, how do you expect someone to sit down and learn algebra when they literally like they're in fight or flight survival mode constantly? Like, how do you like? It's an impossible expectation, and you're a kid, so your brain is nowhere near done developing, and you're a traumatized kid by virtue of being here and also by virtue of all of the reasons that got you here. So it's just, and then there's just no way to give space to that complexity. So being in that experience, it just boggled my mind how everyone just sort of accepted that as normal. That was the kind of like the crux of it. I was like, how is everyone just sort of like has just they're so conditioned to accept that like, oh, this is fine. And it reminds you of what we're all capable of, is like you get into this routine, you get into this society, you get into this whatever, and we have a remarkable capability of accepting tragedy and atrocity as normal if we're exposed to it long enough, and we all have that in us. And so it kind of made me for the first time like aware of that propensity that we all have.
When you would talk to these kids and you're having a conversation with them, like what were you having a conversation about? Because I can imagine you probably don't have a lot of like shared common interests at at that point in life. So like, what are you having a conversation with some of them about?
So it's so funny you ask that, because I'm so glad that I had this experience when I was relatively young. I think I was like 19, 20 when I was having these experiences with these kids. And so they were maybe like between the ages roughly of like 13 and 17, I think was probably the average age. And like I remember kind of feeling like I was their age. I kind of like, aside from the very different experiences that we had, like I wasn't that much older than them. And so they kind of came to feel like my friends as I was like going there. Like it didn't feel like there was this like weird separation between us. Like I'm the teacher and you're the student. It's like I'm still kind of a kid too. So like I feel like, and these kids are also kids who had to grow up really fast. So they were like more accelerated in their like trajectory to adulthood, tragically so. And I was like, I still feel like I'm, 15 years old. Like I don't really feel like I grew up past that point. Like I think I kind of just stopped there. So like I remember kind of just trying to talk with these kids as if they were my peers, because they kind of were in a way, putting aside the different like life experiences and life paths. But um in doing that, like, we would joke around, like we would make fun of the wardens together. Like I just sort of tried to become one of them. And I don't really know why that was my inclination, more so than like trying to be the teacher, because I just had like more of a desire to be like, I want these people to be my homies. Like I don't really want to like have this like weird hierarchy with us. Like I just want to like I want to like have a meaningful connection with these kids, with these guys, because it was boys that I was working with. And yeah, like I don't really care to like be this teacher and like have that identity. Like I just felt instinctually like my social instincts just wanted to try to be friends with them. And even though we had very different experiences, it actually became pretty easy to do that. And it was very easy to sort of like yeah, just like figure out what are the things that they think are funny, what are the where what are they talking about, like what are they doing. And like, when I didn't understand or didn't know like references or things that they were talking about, like they thought it was really funny, and they really enjoyed like having this like knowledge that I didn't have, and they really enjoyed like sharing that with me. So I think now that I'm like kind of reflecting back, it's actually honestly been so long since I've like meaningfully thought about this.
Mm-hmm.
now that I'm like thinking back, I remember that was like a pattern that was pretty common, is they would say something, some term or some word or some reference to some artist that I didn't know. And then I would be like, what's that? And I would be genuinely curious, and they would think, oh, you don't know what that is, like, and they would like make fun of me, and then we would like kind of have like a fun like exchange about that. And they really enjoyed like kind of teaching me and feeling like they had something to teach me, and not just like vice versa. And they some because they were sharing so much about themselves with me through this sort of like pattern that we were in. I don't know if it's because of that, but I do recall them asking me a lot of questions about what college was like, and what is it like to be in college? Like, what do you do every day? Like, what are the classes like? Like, what are you studying? Like, and they had, sort of developed just genuine interest in my experience and what it is like to be in higher education. And I thought that that conversation was more productive than any like work we were going to do on algebra that day. So that's kind of what we devolved into most days. So I think the thing that helped me connect with them was just like a genuine interest in the things that they were interested in their lives. And like we had some really cool conversations happen, and even some like modicum of vulnerability, which is a big deal for them. So it was really cool.
Very cool. Yeah, there's like the classic saying, right? It's like if you want to become interesting, be really interested in other people. And it sounds like
Yeah,
you,
I love that.
yeah, intentionally or unintentionally, but you did that with them, which is really cool. Um, have you like kept in touch with any of them, or like I know seen or heard from any of them, or just watched any of them since they've I know left, or I don't know, I guess not graduated from juvenile hall. I'm not sure what the right term is, but like left
Yeah.
that system and stuff.
No, there was a lot of really strict rules around confidentiality and around not being able to connect with them outside of being with them during tutoring hours. So even if I wanted to, they made sure that there was no way for that to happen, because what would often happen is there would be, the boys would, think that these people who were tutoring them were like their friends, or they would, if it was, if the tutors were female, they would get crushes on them. And they're, of course,
Mm-hmm.
naturally, right? So
Right.
there was a lot of efforts made to make sure that like we could not connect with each other outside of that. And I think it had something to do, I really can't remember this detail, but it had something to do with like how we introduced ourselves. Like we could never give our last name or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
so that we couldn't like meaning talk to them or do anything outside of the time that we had. One of them did somehow still find me on Instagram, and I remember at the time like not accepting it and being like, this feels dangerous, because if I have a connection with this kid, it's dangerous for him, because if it's found out that he's trying to connect with me, he is the one who will suffer, not me. So I didn't accept it, because I was just so afraid of the repercussions for him if he was caught doing what he very, very clearly was not supposed to do.
Mm. Yeah, that's a tough position to be in. I guess I'm curious from your perspective that we've talked about a lot of like the intersection of how interconnected we all are, and like doing the right thing, and like you talked a lot about the dehumanization aspect of people, and one of them is being that type of connection. So I'm curious, do you feel like the level of disconnection they want you to have in that situation is actually appropriate? Because there are, to your point, like dangers and risks and that kind of thing, and then I can imagine at the same time there is this like a a sadness or
Mm,
a lack of this person getting to experience this type of a connection in a
mm,
short period of window, and then not be able to have a sustained support network and connection afterwards that
mm-hmm.
they could benefit from mentorship or other avenues of this. So like where do you kind of see that system as it was when you dealt with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I felt conflicted in the way that you just expressed, right? Like and I know that there are like things that are more akin to mentorship programs that people try to instill for situations like this. And I think that, I did the tutoring part of this program, but I think there was like a mentorship program for kids who were recently incarcerated. And I remember I had a friend who was a part of that program, because he also grew up like in and out of the system. And I remember thinking that that program was very cool. And then I also remember fearing being out of my depth in a program like that on account of not ever being incarcerated and not ever actually directly having that experience. So how the hell could I mentor a kid like that? You know,
Sure.
it would be pretty bold of me to think that I have anything from my experience, from my life experience, to express any level of genuine understanding for what it is like to grow up in the system like that, and to go through, you know, a lot of these kids also grew up in foster care, jumping from foster home to foster home. Like that was a very common experience for a lot of these guys. So like even if it wasn't just the incarceration, but it was just the constant instability for like the majority, if not the entirety of their lives. And I remember like thinking a lot about that and like trying to imagine what that must feel like. And I can give it my best guess empathetically, but I know it'll never come close to what it actually feels like. So I know that there are things in place that do allow for a more kind of holistic connection. The program I was in was not it. But I do remember like if knowing about kind of opportunities that were adjacent to that, that I could have done if I wanted to like have like a long-term connection with these guys. And I remember not doing it because I was like, the people who were doing that were primarily people who had more some kind of connection to that life, and I don't. And so I was like, you know, the thing I can offer is like academic help, education, and then organically we had conversations, and that was dope. But the thing
Mhm.
that I felt like I could offer them was like a chance to have a better career and academic trajectory when they, you know, once they're released, by tutoring them for the GED. But yeah,
Yeah.
I feel you. It's a complicated issue for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I was really fascinated by when you're talking about their interest in asking about college and education. Obviously, your experience as a whole, but I can imagine, especially for them. I mean, I grew up in, a privileged, white suburban, world where it was like very much expected, if anything, to go to
Yep.
college. I took college prep classes was like the type of course that I, took for the most part. And
Same.
that was,
Same.
really considered like expected. It wasn't even there was an average class, like the average class, the standard class was kind of seen as like the, below expectation class, if you will, right? Where I went.
Hmm.
And yet I've also, known people who don't come from places like that. And,
Hmm.
they can talk about the idea of going to college as this like fantastic,
Hmm.
amazing, or like impossible, ridiculous thing to do. And
Hmm.
I'm curious about what were the questions that they were asking about college? Like, were they asking about it in a way where they were curious about going for it themselves, or like what were they curious about? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the head. Like a lot of them thought about like college or higher education as this very like lofty, unattainable thing for them. And like if they wanted to go to college, like they were like, this is the end goal. You know, this is if I make it to college, like that is the best thing ever. You know,
Mhm.
and yeah, they some of them, yeah, had genuine interest in like, well, what kind of classes do you take, like what does that look like what are your teachers like do you what do you call them, like what do you call your teachers, do you call them professor, like wow, like they thought that that was really cool. um they thought the idea of living in a dorm was cool, so they were interested in the cult, you know, in the lifestyle of, you know, a traditional college experience.
Mhm.
They were interested in like, yeah, just like things that I think implied that they were starting to, in some way, some of them were starting to like think of like, oh cool, like maybe college is not so out of the question, right? And I thought that that was really cool because regardless of, you know, college is not right for everyone for various reasons, but I don't ever believe it should not be right for someone because they think it's impossible, right? Like
Mhm.
that shouldn't be the reason why someone doesn't go to college, because they think it's not possible for them. You know, if you have another
Yeah.
reason why you don't want to go to college because it's not a good fit for you, like dope, more power to you, right? But this was a very different flavor of that, and it made me very sad because like you, I grew up in an environment where it was my high school was called a college preparatory. Like
Mhm.
99% of graduates from my high school went to college. It was like a wild thing if you decided you weren't going to go to college. I didn't know anybody who I was in school with who wasn't going to go to college. It just wasn't even an option. So,
Mhm.
yeah, to see that there are people who have a completely different experience of that was also, yeah, like it just it pissed me off. I was like, how, like this is crazy. Like like I am here with the privilege that I have. Like yes, I worked for it, but like these kids could work 20 times harder than me and still not have what I have. And that fucking sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of curious about like even what your thought process is on the current college system or how that's even designed. I know it's like an abstract concept, so I'll give a little bit of where I'm going with
Mhm.
that. And like I think about it a lot with I think it breaks my heart that I feel like so many people or we have sort of positioned college in the market as this thing that you do to get a degree to get a better job. And I think that's
Mm,
also
yeah.
brought a lot of the same distaste that we feel towards college. Yeah, not necessarily myself, but like a lot of people have towards college with student loans and all these different things, because it's like, oh well, here's this thing this kind of like red tape I have to just theoretically go to get a piece of paper. And I would hear people talk about it, and it dawned on me like in the last like 6 months to a year, where I was like, what happened when like I went to college to study the thing that I was like obsessed with and like
Yeah.
learn and like to like have education and to go take really interesting classes and have really beautiful conversations with my professor who, you know, lives in this world for so long, and my classmates, and these really deep discussions and write really meaningful papers that got me to think about things in very significantly different ways or challenge my
Mm,
preconceptions or be able to argue for myself.
yeah.
And I see that like I don't know, it like breaks my heart that there's so little of an emphasis on education and learning for learning's sake, like the intrinsic value of learning.
Mm, yeah.
Um, and I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on any of that, and like even I don't know how it relates to them, because it sounds like that might even be part of their own fascination was like the actual ability to learn and experience something new.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with all of that. I think it's sad that college has become very like a means to an end, a means to a good career, a means to a higher salary. Like it can give you all of that. And like that's dope. You know, I'm not saying that's a bad
Hmm?
thing. But when
No.
that becomes the focus at the expense of this really beautiful holistic picture that you painted of like learning for learning's sake and being able to have discussions and debates, like that is what those are the days and those are the discussions that I remember about college, you know, like
Mhm.
the times when I was in class and like there were kids who, you know, we were all kids who had like different views from mine, and like being able to just like talk about that, you know, there's literally close to no spaces left, especially in this country now, where people can literally just sit down and have differing viewpoints and different perspectives and fucking talk about it in a way that is not personal, in a way that is not like vindictive or malicious or combative, but like with a genuine desire to like engage in a conversation with someone whose brain has come to different conclusions from yours, because you understand that that will help your position because it might change it, expand it, or you know, help solidify it. Like we don't have space for that anymore, and I think that is a tragedy. And I
Yep.
am sad that this, even, you know, in higher education, the space for that is becoming smaller and smaller, because there is such a, you know, such a monetary fueled, like a financially fueled mindset that a lot of people have in going to college, like, oh, I want to get a better job so I can, you know, support my family better and all of that, and then that becomes what you're focused on every day. um, and I think it's because, you know, a lot of people tend to be, you know, they might have poverty trauma, they might have poverty trauma that may not even be theirs, but it's from their parents or their parents' parents, and they, you know, because of that you become very focused on survival, and survival means making enough money. And it's, again, it's this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think, where if like that's all, if you don't feel secure in that, or you don't feel confident in that, how the hell are you going to be able to talk about, like, you know, the meaning of the word hegemony in philosophy class? Like you're not going to like you're not going to be able to do it because you're going to be worried about making enough money that year or whatever, making enough money for the future or for your family currently. And I think like I think it's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it, but I can see how for people who are like have constantly been in that and don't know what it's like to be outside of that, like construct of every day, like primarily being the majority of your thoughts being survival based, thinking about a world and a place where you don't, that's not your main focus. And I think college represents that to a lot of people. um, and so maybe that is one of the reasons why some of these kids were interested in it. I don't really know. But I think it's a really good point, and I certainly think it's possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of college, I know that you said they were interested in the typical college experience, but from what you and I had a conversation about before, it sounded like your college dorm experience, at the very least, was very different. Can you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I went to a small liberal arts college, but within that college was a like an integrative studies area, and that section of the college informed both the way in which you took classes, and it also informed your living situation because there were two buildings that housed us. So academically, it was sort of the idea behind the program was we're gonna like run all the way with this idea that you were talking about of like we're gonna learn and think for the sake of it and for the love of it, and we're not gonna be like goal oriented, we're not going to be mechanical about it, and the way we're going to try to do that is we're not going to have grades, we're not going to have a syllabus traditionally, we're not going to have GPAs instead, and we're not going to have prerequisites. So there's still gonna be a unit requirement because we're a part of this greater college, and in order to graduate, you need X amount of units. Fine, can't get around that. But we're not gonna overly kind of calculate how you get there. We're going to give you more freedom to like get there however you want, and to perform not for a grade and not for a number, but for just the love of it and for the fascination of it. And you get to explore how each class um, benefits you the most. And so instead of a syllabus, we would take a class, and instead of like having to like go through the lesson plan, we would create contracts with our professors, and the professor and the kid would get together and modify the syllabus in a way that reflected what that student wanted to learn about and what that student wanted to get out of the class. So there may be lessons or units that would be, amplified, and then there may be others where they're like, this isn't really what I'm looking for here, and then you could get rid of that or you could modify it or whatever. So it was a way to sort of like tailor classes and tailor your college experience to your specific needs and desires and what you wanted to get out of it. And the other side of it, to your question with respect to the living situation, is everything was sort of like all norms are being questioned. When you have a department like that, the people who are attracted to it are not just going to question academic norms. They're going to fucking question every norm you could think of, excessively, comically.
Mhm.
And so we lived in still dorms, but everything, every decision, every rule, every regulation was decided by consensus. And it was very non-hierarchical. Everybody's voice is equal. Like there's no one person leading it. We all take turns leading the discussion, like so that everybody has a chance to like both listen and to lead. Like anybody can take up any role. There was a lot of queerness, so a lot of questioning of not only gender roles but gender itself, which was at the time it was like what was that like 20? I graduated in 2017. So at the time, that kind of conversation was just sort of starting to ramp up and become popular around like queerness and gender identity and all of that stuff. So that space I was in was sort of one of the first voices to really kind of talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so one of the policy, I think this is what the policy you and I talked about when we were at Lightning in a Bottle, but was the clothing policy on our dorms. So and also the dorms were co-ed, the bathrooms were co-ed. There was no gender segregation because there was a big movement or a awareness toward trying to kind of lessen gender and the existence of gender in our lives because it was seen as a limiting thing and not an expansive thing. So, of course, like 18-year-old me is like, wow, this is so cool. Everything is being questioned. This is so edgy and awesome. I'm going to do all of it.
Mhm.
I'm going to lean into all of it. And I got to see the beauty of it and also the limitations of living in a place like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, the clothing policy I think is one of the ones that people think is like the most interesting because it's so outside the bounds of what most spaces are down for. So one of the
Mhm.
discussions that was an ongoing discussion because you can reopen an issue at any point, um, was about when you are moving around like public spaces in the dorms, like, do you have to be clothed? Because some people would prefer not to, especially because the bathrooms were like in the hallway area, and so you had to like
Hmm.
walk across the hallway in order to go to the bathroom or to take a shower. So like, how clothed do you have to be in a public space? um and like, where is the line there, and like, where do we draw the line between like what someone's personal preference is around how they want to, you know, move around with their body versus like other people's comfort or discomfort around that. And so there
Hmm.
was like a constant, very interesting conversation around like, where do we draw the line there. And I think at our most nudity friendly decision point, because it was always fluid, but at our most
Hmm.
like nudity friendly side of this conversation, we decided on nudity. Complete nudity is dope, but you have to put a towel down in public spaces when you sit down, so that your
Reasonable.
junk is not in a public space, like sitting on a, is not, just bare ass on a public space for sanitary reasons, but not
Hmm.
for body shaming reasons.
Hmm.
So that was like where we landed. And then, there are other people who were like, I'm not really down for that. Like, I'm not really down to like experience, someone walking around with their genitals out just day to day when I'm coming back from philosophy class. Like, I'm not really
Hmm.
down for that. Um, and so then different floors of the dorm sort of had different versions of the policy. So I think it was the third floor was like the most nudity is okay. So if you were down for that, either if you actively preferred it or you didn't care, you tended to live on the third floor. Second floor was some sort of like middle ground. I forgot what the parameters were of like the nudity
Hmm.
situation on that floor. And then on the first floor, it was a more traditional like, nah, you gotta have clothes on, like if you're gonna be in public spaces. But I think even the first floor supported like toplessness all around, and everyone was about
Hmm.
free the nipple. Free the nipple was like a very easy thing for all of us to get to. The genital
Hmm.
conversation was the one that separated us by floor. So
Fascinating.
that's where the war started, was with the genitals.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was kind of my experience in that situation.
Yeah. When people are doing tours at that school and that they're maybe interested in that particular program, are they taking kids to the dorms and just full on like seeing the current students walk around nude? Like what would happen in those situations?
So, excellent question. So, how it actually played out was during, and then okay, the other thing now that you said that, it's reminding me too of, I think for some parts of the dorm there was like a delineation between during school
Mm.
hours you have to be clothed, but like in the evenings it's okay for you to be nude. I think that may have been part of it. But if there
Mm.
was like open office hours or visiting hours where out people who didn't belong to the center could come, whether that be people touring or people who were not part of the center. Because the other cool thing about our dorms is on the first floor we had our professors offices were in the same building as our dorms, so it was really like this idea of like living learning. So like if I wanted to talk to my professor, I could literally just get into my pajamas and go downstairs and like talk to them at any hour because they were there often and they were in the same place where I lived, which I thought was really cool. I
Mm.
really really liked that part of
Yeah.
it. um but yeah, there was a lot of awareness of like, we are very much not like, the things we're talking about and thinking about are like, most people are like not down for that, and like that's okay. So like we had a lot of things in place that like prevented that situation where like kids or like visitors would come in and just see someone walking around nude. And the other
Yeah.
part that I thought was very interesting is like, especially for the people who are like very like strong, took a strong position in favor of like people should be nude if they want to, like when that policy was like allowed was there, very few people from what I saw anyway like took advantage of it. Like every now and then, like on like the occasional like super drunk party night you might see it, or like, on various occasions. But I never actually saw like this normal culture of just people being nude all the time. It was even though you could. So
Mm.
I thought that that was very interesting too. Like even though people fought so hard for it, even the people who were fighting hard for it weren't like routinely nude all the time. It was only
Mm.
like sometimes. So
Yeah.
yeah, it wasn't as pervasive as you would think, given how passionate the conversations were.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like, why do you think that dichotomy exists?
I'm not sure. I think it might have something to do with like people wanting in a perfect world to be able to do that, but then maybe knowing that there are other people who, even though like they consented on the policy, like everyone's thoughts and feelings are now known, so then, you know, maybe not
Mm,
feeling as down to do it. Or maybe like the people who wanted to have that policy wanted to have it so that they themselves could work up to it. Who
mm,
knows? Like I think like it might have to do with like the various reasons why people argued for it and how that related to like what they personally actually wanted. Because like, and I was actually one of those people. Like I was in these conversations and I was like, yeah, we should not have to wear clothes. Like that's stupid. Like why do we wear clothes? Like what? Um, and and then that policy happened and like I was never naked in the hallway. There was no personal desire on my part to like be naked in public. Like that's not the place I was
mm,
arguing it from. I was really
mhm,
arguing it from a place of like I intellectually recognize that clothing in most cases like is not like it's pointless. It's like a silly thing. And I was really at the height of that, like, you know, fuck social norms. I was like 19 years
mhm,
old. So I was like, fuck clothing, like fuck gender, fuck capitalism, fuck all of that. Like let's just be free in a commune. And so I was arguing it from that place, but it wasn't from a place of like I personally feel oppressed because I wear clothes. There was not a
mm.
personal relationship to like that. So I argued for it, we got it, and then I never actually took advantage of that policy.
uh, I think you like touched on a really like common and beautiful dichotomy. I think that we exist with as humans, right? Where we can often have very intellectual ideals or thought processes or whatever, and then we are kind of like we run into a I don't know, a very like real aspect of things, right? Where it's like, oh, there's like this emotional component of where like I actually like enjoy wearing clothes, or you talk about like the idealistic of like, oh, I want to go live in a commune, we'll be all free, and like intellectually this all makes perfect sense. But then when we kind of like meet reality, there's not that same
Yeah.
sentiment. And I'm sure like as you grew in your own maturity of like maybe your own intellectual ideals, and then meeting like the realities of how are you identify with your gender and like all the other components that go into life, that has like changed and synthesized. So like how, I guess like my question with that is like how have you integrated that part? I don't know if to call it like the instinctual part or the emotional part, or these other aspects that are not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily directly intellectual in the same way that we typically think of, but still have their own knowledge or wisdom or insight. Like how have you sort of incorporate that as you
Mm.
developed?
Yeah, damn. I think the the like progression on my part, or regression depending on how you look at it, but like the journey that I've gone on with that is like pick your battles and like know why you're picking the battles that you pick, and
Mm,
also know that you cannot pick every battle, and if you pick every battle then you're really picking no battle. So like that's kind of like where I've arrived with that, in terms of like I intellect the clothing is a great example. Like sure, like I get it. I feel it. Makes sense from an intellectual level, but like it's not at this point in my life the hill that I'm going to die on, because I think that there are other things that resonate with me in my own like what feels more urgent and what feels more I'm so reluctant to say important, because I think everyone feels like their issue is the most important thing, and that's so
sure.
subjective, but I think there's just some things that like in my bones I feel I should be focusing on. And if I focus on everything always just because of my ideology and not because of like a functional desire to actually implement it, you're going to burn out, first of all. And it's also going to make your voice feel less consequential, because you're going to just be the person who is just fighting about everything for the sake of fighting about it. And you're going to just fall in love with your identity as a contrarian, which is definitely like a pitfall that I have fallen into at an earlier age. And I see people fall into all the time. They just internalize this identity of being a contrarian. They're like, I question everything. I'm outside of the norm, and like I am, you know, blah blah blah, and that's why I'm special. And that means, unfortunately, for that pattern that I again fell into as like a young person, like you are going to not actually be thoughtful. You're not going to be thoughtful about the positions that you take, because you're going to pick the one that is fundamentally the minority because it is the minority, and not necessarily because or the one that's like outside of society. And I feel like, yeah, like the idea of like figuring out what is it that really in your core you feel is wrong or should be shifted or evolved in the world. It might be a million things, and like which ones are you thinking about the most? And you can, unpack why, but the why is not as important as like the what here, I think. And I think for me, like, there's just some things, and I don't always even know why, I just gravitate to more. The carceral system, the justice system, animal rights, things centering on gender. Like, there are certain things that I just feel, and race. Like, there are just certain things that I feel I think about the most. And I don't always know why, but I kind of just stick with that. And there might be ancillary issues or topics that, like, I also agree with when I'm having a conversation with someone about it, but I am not going to like center a career around it, and I am not going to like stand up and like argue with everyone I see when I see them having a different position. So I think it's about picking your battles and understanding, yeah, just knowing what those battles are, and then the why can be a cool addition, but I think I'll stick with the what being the more important thing.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of similar what you said earlier, right? Where it's partly about like also knowing your strengths, right? So knowing your human
Yeah.
experience, what you know, what you don't know, right? Like as a, again, white, suburban raised, human being, born Christian, like the
Mm,
amount that I
yeah.
know about even a large issue like the Israel Palestine conflict, right, is like so minimal to the people who are actually in those situations. My Jewish friends, my Arab friends, like all of that is they have a much deeper level of experience with that. And there's only so much that I can ever really understand about an issue like that, right? That is so
Hmm.
deeply interwoven and complex that like, and with so many issues that do exist, whether it's a trans issue, it's a gender issue, a race issue, a legal issue, an incarceration issue, a economic issue. There's so many different pieces that it to your point, it can become overwhelming, right? We have that like the paradox of choice aspect, but it's just also, especially with things with social media and all these different pieces, right? We are inundated with way more suffering in the world than we ever have had, just like at our fingertips at all times.
Facts.
Um, and it can just overwhelm us into a place where we are just depressed and not do anything, or we feel like we have to know everything about everything. And again, we sort of take ineffective action versus creating positive effect and change, like where we can at our best, based
Mm.
on the experience, the gifts, the talents, the all the things we have to be who we are.
Yeah, I feel you. That is a interesting and difficult paradox that I find myself in often. And I think like that kind of reminds me of the conversation that people like to have around like allyship versus, being someone who is like most principally dedicated to a specific issue. So I think about like I remember especially in like 2020 and the height of the George Floyd stuff. Um, I was obviously aware of the issue of black men being disproportionately victims of police brutality and disproportionately being killed by the police. Like I was aware of that issue, but when that issue like exploded like it did with George Floyd for I think a variety of really interesting and complicated reasons, like I remember thinking like, okay, like what is, and this was a conversation that was happening a lot around George Floyd. Like, what is the role of white people in this? What is the role of me as like a white person who like I see it, I'm fucking angry about it, and I don't know exactly what to do. And there were a
Mm-hmm.
lot of conversations around looking at implicit bias and looking at and being reminded of, the how unfortunately in this country race still fundamentally informs the experience you're going to have, like socially and in every way, and calling attention to that. And I really got to like think about the concept of allyship in that time and space. And I've not yet figured out how to be an effective ally while simultaneously like not, in all of the issues that come up in our lives and that are shown to us through social media and through all of the ways in which we receive information. How to be an effective ally and support, because that concept of allyship I think also is inherently an expression of an awareness of the interconnectedness, right? racial justice issues are not just racial justice issues. Those issues are connected to every other issue that you can imagine. They're connected to gender. They're certainly connected to socioeconomic issues. They're connected to poverty. They're connected to the environment, the concept of environmental racism. You could go on and on and on about all of the different complex combinations of ways in which these issues relate to each other. And when you're an ally for one, I think if there's ways to do that that show an awareness that it's all connected, and how to figure out how to strategically allocate your energy is, I don't know. Let me know when you figure it out. I have no idea. Really.
Yeah. I mean, I think to your point, all I've figured out how to do is figure out, I think there's a lot to be said about listening to that inner voice that you didn't directly call out, I guess, but that part of you that knows like this is the right thing for me to do. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily know why. I find that often the thing that might not feel the most logical, or
Mm-hmm.
might not be the most logical from a purely mental standpoint, but the thing that feels the most correct when
Yeah.
we follow that like leads to that outcome. Because and I think there's so many potentialities for us on what we're going to do in any moment, right? And that there's a level of impossibility of trying to mathematically come up with whatever the right answer is because we don't know. I mean, I think part of the challenge that we exist with as human beings is not knowing if like, hey, if I help this person, if what if like that me helping that person ends up like, well, that person's actually like the next Hitler, and that because I helped them in that moment, right? They
Yeah.
got a leg up and were able to have that world domination thing that happened. And it's like, well, shit, did I just like create that problem and I created immense amount of human suffering because I did something good? Because at some point in that chain of event of like Hitler's life, there was kindness that led to like his parents being their parents at some point and having him as a child and doing all those things, and yet like great evil comes from that thing. And at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, great evil or a harmful thing happening to somebody can lead to a great positive change because that person wakes up
Mm-hmm.
to the dangers that happen and lead to these things. There's actually one of my favorite books is The Name of the Wind and The Wise
Ooh,
Man's Fear. It's a part of the King Killer Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. And in the second
cool.
book, in Wise Man's Fear, there's a
Mm-hmm.
character called the Cathay. And for anybody who's listening, I'm not like, or reading that currently, I'm not really giving away anything spoiler that's going to destroy anything. But if you do want to skip this, fine. But the Cathay is known as this character who can see all potential paths of the future, right? And he's also very sinister. And so he's protected from nobody's able to talk to him because when you go and talk to the Cathay, he will tell you things in such a way to create the effect of the future that he wants to see, which is usually like death and destruction and all these terrible things, right?
Damn.
And yeah, right. So it's like a very scary, character. And yet at the same time, really, when you think about it, it's like if something is that powerful and it has ever talked to anything once, well, then its plan is already like in motion, right? Like there's nothing you can really do. There's like this sense of fear and impossibility. There's horrible things that are going to happen because we end up talking to this thing. But it's like ultimately, like it's
Mm.
either true or it's not true. But like either way, if it's really that level of immense power, there's nothing that I can do about it as a human, right? All I can do is make the choice that I'm going to make that I think is right in any given situation with the limited information that I have, and pray that it's the best thing, and ask for forgiveness if it's not.
Yeah. I. It's. It can be a frustrating place to be to not have that level of like knowledge, and I think like sometimes when I feel it's like so cheesy, but it's also kind of speaks to like the kind of just knowing sometimes like that this is the right thing and not really being able to fully articulate why, which is a place that I'm getting like more and more comfortable being in. I really enjoy being able to be like, I think we should do this because blah 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 blah, right? Like that's my job. But
Mm-hmm.
being able to sit with, I think this is the right thing to do. This feels like the right thing to do. More of this feels rather than I think. Like this feels correct. And I don't really know if I can explain why, but I'm just going to do it. And I think in situations where you're not really sure, like, you get caught up in thinking about this sort of butterfly effect of in the or the ripples that you create when you make any given decision. I'm kind of like, the best I can do then when I am not sure is to just choose the thing that is the kindest. And I
Mm.
think somehow that ripple, even if it goes through like waves of sinisterness or waves of like unideal outcomes, like somehow just feel like if you decide to just be fucking kind, it's almost always, if not always, going to be the thing that is going to lead us collectively to a place with less unnecessary suffering. And I don't know how that happens. I don't know like what mechanism that happens through, but I think like this sort of like cheesy like put it on a glass plate and hang it on a wall phrase of like when in doubt just be kind, I think is the best solution I can come up with now until someone gives me a better one. And I remember, I don't know if you've seen, and I'm not going to spoil it, but the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
feel like that movie really speaks to and takes a really beautiful and poignant position on this concept of kindness. And I won't expand on it anymore because it does spoil it. But but that's my like tagline for that movie. If for folks who haven't seen it, I think it's really, really good watch. And the ending scenes, the kind of conclusory scenes of that movie, more than anything, sort of express this idea that kindness is really the antidote to apathy and like the harmful kind of nihilism that we sort of fall into. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that's sort of like what I veer toward when I can't come up with like a more logical solution or set of um, things to do to
Yeah.
address the situation.
Yeah. It struck me as you talked about that, like the other aspect for me in that movie, and I won't spoil it either, but I think anybody who's seen it will know the concepts that we're talking about and why, but is also the importance of kindness with letting go, right? Like, there's a very specific part. I think you can
Yeah.
imagine it at the movie, right? And
Hmm.
that happens, and
I've seen it too many times.
yeah, and so there, like, that kindness with the gripping intention, right? The pulling and like the not trusting of the individual, if you will. Like, I
Hmm.
think a lot of times there's a lot of things that were good intentions. With good intentions, we restrict, right? It's like probably even to a certain degree, like the prison system, right? It's like, oh well, we need to put people in here to punish them so that they stop doing things away in a particular way, right? Versus like, how do we like treat them kindly? How do we find a way to like reinvigorate like trust in their decisions, even if we don't think that they're the best decisions or the right decisions or whatever on our own? Because I think for me, a fundamental part of it is like being able to respect someone's autonomy and choice.
Mm.
Because when we try to restrict them, even with good intentions, we end up creating more sufferings and more problems because there's a natural human inclination to rebel, right? It's like when somebody's
Hmm.
forcing me to do something, that
Hmm.
principle of force. There's a great book by David Hawkins called Power versus Force. I think that is a huge aspect. It's a part of it that concerns me with a lot of how just government is set up, where it's like we're kind of forced to do XYZ thing that might be a good benefit, but through the means of force, we lose that true benefit that it could actually have, right? We
Hmm.
the how matters, and when we're not like treating it with that how, we're not using influence to actually use power to create change. We are
Totally.
forcing it to happen. It has all these negative downstream effects that we don't foresee.
Hmm. Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Like yeah, it's hard to always know, but I think that those guiding principles are kind of all we have sometimes, and learning to trust that I think is a skill in and of itself. Totally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's it like to win a court case?
It doesn't happen often, and that's why that and it's actually so funny that you mentioned that because I as I said I just did a closing argument yesterday
Mm-hmm.
for a sex case actually, and it was a guilty verdict. My girlfriend Stephanie actually, it was the first time she got to come to court and like see what a
Mm-hmm.
trial looks like or what a closing argument looks like, and she was very invested in this particular case because of the facts of the case, and it was a guilty verdict. It was a loss. It was always going to be a loss. And there were a lot of other kind of complicated and like other reasons why it was the right thing to do the trial, other than thinking that it was a good case for, you know, a not guilty. So I'm much more, by virtue of the kind of job that I have, I'm much more familiar with what it feels like to lose. But winning is its own kind of delicious. One of my favorite wins I ever had in court was also a trial, and it was for elder abuse. And I was representing a homeless woman who lived at a park out of her car with her little dog. And she every day would go out to the park area, and she would take this like rake and broom, and she would like rake the leaves and like sweep the sidewalk, the concrete, and just kind of keep the space clean. But she was a visibly unhoused woman, and across the street from this park was an 88-year-old woman, an elder, who liked to walk her dogs around that park, and was so uncomfortable with the idea of an unhoused person living there, having her car parked out there, even though she's just literally living there. She's not bothering anyone. She's just living her life. But there was just this inherent discomfort with having her in her vicinity. So this woman would go over to my client and sort of like pick fights with her, pick arguments, and would get all up in her face and say, why don't you get a job? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And would constantly instigate these conflicts with my client. And at a certain point, the leashes of their dogs got tangled up, and they got all up in each other's faces. And my client, or the woman, got so close to her that my client, who's also an older woman, so kind of almost close to both of them being elders, actually. It's almost like elder on elder. But she leaned back and like said, get away from me, and pushed her. And this tiny 88-year-old woman like flew back, like in this like very cartoonish way, and way more than you would expect her to, just based on like the level of force that my client used. But this woman is like 88 years old and like frail, and she flew back onto the street, like got her legs kind of knocked out from under her, fell on the concrete, and fractured her pelvis. And people around the park saw this, went to go help this old lady. My client was like very scared, felt horrified at what had happened, you know, was just trying to get this woman to leave her alone. Police were called, and my client was arrested, and that's the basis of the elder abuse. So we were able to argue self-defense effectively, and it was a not guilty. And that victory for me was particularly satisfying because I got to argue duality in my closing argument, where I got to say, like, you know, this old woman, we can all be like sad that she fractured her pelvis, right? We can all be like not stoked about that, and we can feel sorry for her, and we can have empathy for her. And at the same time, we don't have to vilify this person because we feel sorry for this person. Like, you can hold both at the same time. And that was sort of like the crux of my argument. Like, the prosecution was really trying to push, like, look at this poor old woman, and like, look at what happened to her, and she's so vulnerable, and we need to protect her because she's so vulnerable, and this very like paternalistic attitude to try to, and then, you know, infused with legal arguments, to be fair, but like that was sort of like the essence of their argument, right?
Sure.
And the only answer I could have to that was like, I'm not going to say, like, I couldn't say, or it would not be smart for me to be like, fuck this old lady, like, fuck this old bitch. Like, I'm not going to, like, you guys, you either like my client, this homeless woman, or you like this old lady. But like, I think you should like my client better because fuck this old lady. Like, you should hate her. And she's like this adorable tiny woman who like came to court to testify in with like a walker because she was still recovering from her injuries. And like,
Jesus.
we had to get really close to her because she was like almost deaf. So when I'm cross-examining her, I have to like scream at her because she can't hear. So like, not someone that I thought was strategically smart to like try to vilify, even though alongside being a vulnerable old woman, she's also like this person who really has a strong bias, I'll say, to be nice. Like, she, you know, has a strong bias against homeless people, against my client specifically. So the only thing I could argue, and it really taught me like the value of trying to argue this elegantly, is like, look, sure, like feel sorry for her. It's cool. Like this is a sad situation. Like nobody wants somebody's pelvis to be fractured. Like that sucks. Damn. And also, my client didn't do anything wrong. And like, let's see if we can open our minds enough to be able to hold both at the same time. And that's like
Mm.
a really cool thing that we can do as humans. Like, my
Yeah.
client is not guilty of this. She was defending herself. This woman got in her space. She got up, she got in her way. She felt like she was under attack physically, so she pushed her out of her space.
Hmm.
Um, and like that was a reasonable thing for her to do. And it also sucks that she fractured her pelvis. Like those can both be true, and
Yeah.
one does not minimize the other. And I really enjoyed, I think, that result, both because like obviously like there was a justice angle for my client, which I was very happy
Mm.
to have, but I feel that way about all my clients, so that wasn't unique. I
Mm.
always feel like, there's an angle in which the outcome that I want for my client is like justice for my client, for whatever that
Mhm.
means. So that was very easy and that was normal. But the thing that I really loved about this argument, and the thing I really loved about this case, was talking about kind of like the thing that I think we need to be talking about more if we're going to transform our justice or our criminal system, because there's no justice in it right now, but transform our criminal system to actually collectively help our society, because it's not anywhere fucking close to that right now. And I think that conversation starts with getting rid of this false dichotomy between victim and aggressor and perpetrator, because it's not a real
Mm.
thing. It's completely fabricated. It's absolute propaganda. They don't, like, someone's punishment or vilification does not inform or actually is not actually necessary for the person who was harmed to heal. And it's not necessary for us to vilify a victim in order to, help someone who, may or may not have done harm. Like this idea of like this us versus them, is just super not helpful. And there are
Mm.
cases where I do have to argue a more us versus them because it strategically makes sense. This was
Mm.
not one of them. So I really enjoyed having like a conventionally sympathetic victim, and also like being able to talk about holding both. So winning a case, any case, is fucking delicious, but winning a case like that was really special for me.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you for that story. I mean, it's fascinating, and it makes sense based on the conversation we've had and like your values around like the interconnectedness and just seeing people both as human, right? Like being able to be like, hey, yeah, this sucks for this woman, to not vilify your opponent essentially, right? Being able to be like, yeah, like you're a human, this person's a human. Like you didn't have to resort to blame, I guess, in one way or another, or turning somebody
Hmm.
else into the enemy, right? You were able to see
Hmm.
both people as human and still find some semblance of like justice within that and win your case, which must feel really great to do so in alignment with the things that you really believe
Yeah, it was dope.
in. Yeah.
Doesn't happen often, right? So that's
Right.
why it was especially dope, because it's not often that you get a case that kind of has both, right? Like I get to argue what I actually like at my core think is the issue with our system, and that
Hmm.
argument also just so happens to be the best argument for my client, which will always be the thing that
Hmm.
informs my strategy. So
Right.
yeah, it was really cool.
Yeah. Well, you talked about the fact that like you're not winning most of the cases. Like how do you like mentally and emotionally handle like being in a situation where you're like, well, I'm gonna like lose at my job the vast majority of the time, like knowing that and like putting all this effort in and working so hard and doing all this stuff and being like, well, I'm probably still going to lose. Like, how do you emotionally, mentally handle it? Because I mean, most people do not want to be in a position like that. Most of us like to be in a situation where we can win a good amount of the time, or if not, we're going to make a lot of money the times you do win, I guess.
Yeah, it's not great. It's I think you develop a really good sense of humor. I think you form connections with the people who are in the same boat as you. So like I couldn't do my job without having friends in this job. My some of my best friendships have come from other with or through with other public defenders, because we have this like very specific, unique, hard experience that is hard to really explain to someone who hasn't gone through it. It's very unique. And other people, I love, and it's so meaningful when people are interested in my job. and I always struggle to be able to like adequately do justice to like what the experience is like, because it's just such a wild, I like my job is so wild in so many ways. Like uh I could get into all the ways my job I think is just like hilarious and ridiculous and wild and fun and important and whatever, but I always feel like I fall short. But there's this like common understanding with other public defenders of like, oh yeah, we've been through that, and like, you know, I can, you know, set, you know, like the case I just did, like I can laugh about it with my friends upstairs, and I can just, you know, in my office, and we can kind of make fun of like the absurdity of the situation. And
Mm.
so I think in talking this through, I think humor and laughter has been the thing that more than anything else helps you kind of get through being in a job that you are trained to lose. Like you are
Hmm.
like from the very beginning. This is a story that Steph thought was really interesting and pertinent when I was explaining to her, you know, and when she was learning more about my job, is when I first became a public defender, you know, you go through several months of training, and one of the things that you do when you're being trained to be a public defender is you do these uh, proceedings called preliminary hearings, where you assist a higher up attorney and you run a particular proceeding, and they kind of watch you and make sure you don't like royally fuck it up. And you argue all of these things, and there's this sort of formula that they give you to argue for the client. And the first thing that they have you argue is something called a motion to unshackle. And a motion to unshackle is what we argue for this particular proceeding before the proceeding starts if your client is in custody. And for this particular kind of proceeding, most clients are in custody. So there's all of this case law that says, in so many words, that in most situations, defendants should be able to sit in court without being shackled, and they shouldn't have to be handcuffed. So a lot of our clients are they're either cuffed like this or they're waist chained, depending on various factors. And there's this all of this case law that says that like unless there's like a really specific reason why that's necessary, like by default, we shouldn't be shackling people for their proceedings. You know, we shouldn't be having them sit through a court hearing in chains. There's like bailiffs in the courtroom. There's all these other things that make sure that nobody's going to get hurt. Someone doesn't need to sit in a civilized courtroom in chains, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty like standard, pretty logical. Not only does it make sense to most people, you know, unless, you know, you have this like trumped up fear of criminals, like, but also there's a lot of law that says that that is the case, right? So our
Mm.
trainers have us because they're funny. They have us go into court and stand up, because we have to stand up when we're making this argument, because it's a very important argument, and argue the motion to unshackle and have all of our case law ready to go and like practice our rhetorical skills with the judge and the prosecutor. And we say, you know, Your Honor, like my client is not, you know, he's been completely cooperative since he's been in custody. Like there's no reason why he should be shackled in court. I'd like to make a motion to unshackle him. And and you go through the whole argument, and 9 times out of the 10, the judge will listen to you with like or he'll look at you with like a vacant expression, wait till you're done talking, and then say, motion denied. And as a baby lawyer, you're like, well, what do you mean? Like, this is an outrage. Like, look at the case law. Like, this is crazy. Like, Your Honor, like your job is to follow the law. And the trainers will
Mm-hmm.
kind of like sometimes be in the back, and they'll kind of like laugh, because this is the first lesson that you learn as a public defender, which is it does not matter how right you are legally, ethically, morally, um, just common sense wise. It doesn't matter how correct you are going to lose almost always. And you have to learn how to lose gracefully. And so this is an example of that. And they like to see us get frustrated and get angry. And like they like to see it, you know, how do you learn to push back? When do you learn to stop? How do you learn to pick your battles? And that is the first lesson. And that is why they have us do this fucking argument when you're first learning how to be a public defender, because that is our job, is a job of losing legally and learning how to find value and purpose in your job outside of the technical outcome of the proceedings is kind of what we all learn to do when we're not trying to like laugh about every situation and using humor to either cover it up or process it, depending on how optimistic you are.
Yeah, you kind of talked about that earlier. You had mentioned, you know, you took on this I think you said it was a sex case, and it was, you knew going into it you were going to lose, but it was like really important that you did the case anyway. Can you like share more about that? Like why, what can you win when you lose, I guess?
Mm. I think, yeah, there's a million different ways in which I could think of a lot of scenarios where, and yeah, it wouldn't make sense and you wouldn't know it unless you're like in this world, but like choosing a case or going to trial in a case that you know you're going to lose because there's another reason why it makes sense to do it. Oftentimes, and this was sort of the case here, the prosecution was being excessive and overzealous and was not giving me what I thought was the correct outcome for this case and was truly not budging on what they were offering us because of this like kind of blind vilification of this person, but really not having a reason to, you know, like not having a reason really outside of that. And it was very clear in this situation that there was no reason why they were making the decisions they were making on this case aside from just vehement hatred for this person and what he allegedly did, what he represents to them, and just really turning him into this like monster archetype in their minds. And like that, and not really being able to or being willing to work or think beyond that when we were negotiating and talking about what we were going to do with this case. So that was like one of the reasons. Um, Another reason why some cases go to trial when you know they're going to lose is, well, first and foremost, it's the client's choice. You know, we can advise, we can persuade, we can tell them what we think should happen. But if a case wants, if a client wants to go to trial, even if we don't think it's the dopest idea, and we think
Mm-hmm.
maybe we shouldn't do that because you did it on video or something like that, um, gonna be, you know, the deep. We have not yet perfected the argument that it's a deep fake, and has
Right.
not really gotten much traction in court yet. So, um, so like sometimes a client like truly it is more important for them to be heard and to feel like they have some agency over the outcome of their case than it is for them to avoid punishment. And I've done a trial like that recently as well, where the client, he knew he was going to go down, but he had felt so powerless and so voiceless for the entire,
Mm-hmm.
like, all of the proceedings, all of the events that led up to the incident. Like, he had just felt so silenced that the trial kind of became like a vehicle for him to feel like his perspective was being showcased finally after nobody has ever asked him, nobody has ever listened to him. So even though from a legal perspective and his, you know, version of events didn't really help him a whole lot, he just wanted it to get out there. He wanted somebody to hear him. And so we did it. And he, even though we lost that trial, well, we lost most of it. We got some little ancillary victories, but we lost most of it. And he went to jail for a significant amount of time. He, even though the option to not go to trial would have helped him avoid all of the jail, he still wanted to go to trial, and he still, after he got sentenced, felt no regret for it. So that, I think sometimes in a weird way, the trial becomes a mechanism or like a vehicle for people to feel heard, whether it's through them testifying or through the lawyer finding arguments that stand up for them and that, you know, make their side feel like they have a you know, a voice.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those are two reasons that come up often. There's like a excessive vilification of someone on the side of the prosecution, and or some people literally have no other avenue or mechanism to have their perspective heard, and so they pick a really weird one, which is a jury trial, because it's all they fucking have, and then they use that.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's fascinating to think about, like how, I guess, all the other perspectives going in and like really thinking about what it's like to, the importance of being heard in that situation, right? Because like I went through
Mm-hmm.
a situation where nothing like, well, something happened to me where like I needed to stand up through the legal process, and I felt very
Mm-hmm.
similarly. Like there's a process where it was like, I know this is going to cost me money, and there's like a risk if I don't win and all these different things. But so much of it for me was like, I needed to stand up for my own like ethics, like
Mm-hmm.
principally on an integrity level. Otherwise, I wouldn't feel good about myself moving forward, right, in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fascinating to hear about it from even people in that legal sense of just being like, I need to get this thing out because nobody's effing listening to me.
Yep. It's a
Yeah.
very common experience. Yeah, the legal system in general, and definitely the criminal system, is not set up to like amplify perspectives really on any side. Like there's because
Mm,
it's so like bound by this dichotomy of like guilty, not guilty, and
mhm,
there's no room for really any gray area because of that. And so
mm,
I think an interesting iteration of that is I often see people who are on the other side of it, victims, who are equally, if not more, upset by the criminal system because they
mm,
maybe don't want prosecution, but the prosecutor is going to do it anyway because their preference or what they want is not really a factor. They're going to pursue it either way. Or people who regret calling the police because they didn't know that it was going to be this whole thing that would ruin their lives and like take, have them be forced to come to court to testify and to relive it again and again and whatever. Like they just
mm.
wanted to feel safe in that moment, so they called the police, but they didn't want it to turn into like a criminal prosecution. They just wanted
Right.
help in that moment, but there's no
Mm,
space for that with how the system is currently set up. And it doesn't only fuck over people who are charged, but it fucks over people who call themselves victims or who the system is calling victims too, because they are also now jaded and feel really powerless and like they can't rely on anyone or anything to help them. So
mm.
it's just bad all around.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure that you have thought about this problem a lot, and so I'm curious, what are some of the potential solutions to an issue like that? Like, how would you actually even solve something? Would you just like have a
You know, I'm really good at seeing what the problems are, and I hope that the deeper I'm in the trenches, which is I think one of the reasons why it's important to be here, the solutions will come through. I think like one thing that I think one thing I would love to see is maybe like a more us to really explore the idea of restorative justice without people feeling afraid that it's going to turn into like a traditional criminal proceeding.
Mm,
Because I know that I've heard of scenarios. I haven't had this come up with me specifically, but I've heard of scenarios where defense lawyers, public defenders have like the opportunity or given the opportunity for their client to engage in some sort of restorative justice thing where they get to like sit across a table with the victim and the victim is like, here's how you hurt me and blah blah blah, and then the defendant, I guess, gets to feel empathy and feel sorry and whatever. I don't love that dynamic per se,
yeah.
but I'm not saying that that's the answer because I do still think that that enforces a narrative of the victim's healing is somehow contingent on this other person.
Mm,
And I really truly stand by the premise that they're completely separate. There should be
mm,
space and time for victims to heal, and that may or may not include interacting with the person who caused them harm, but I don't ever think it's necessary.
yeah.
um I think that that's, your what you how you heal and what you heal from, that's an entirely personal thing. And like
Yeah.
sometimes organically and beautifully there may be times when the person who did the harm might be a part of that, but I don't think that it's a necessary thing. So I would love to see something where we are able to give both someone who has been harmed and someone who is allegedly doing the harm um, space to explore where it's coming from, the root of it, like where it came from, why it happened, without fear of those statements at any point being used against them, and without feeling like if they don't comply in the exact right way, that it's going to turn into a criminal proceeding. We have a mechanism in our court for, I guess, like in some cases, you can, if the client has, let's say it's a domestic violence case as an example, there's this thing that some clients have an opportunity to do where if they do a bunch of like therapy and mental health classes and they don't have a criminal record, their case will get dismissed. And so that in and of itself, it's one of the most progressive things we probably have in our criminal court right now. And I don't dislike it, but there are flaws with it that I think really handicap its potential. And I think one of the biggest flaws with it is if the client doesn't do exactly what these doctors say that this client should do in the exact right time and place, if they miss too many therapy sessions, if they relapse too many times, if they, pick up another case, if they're not perfect, there's a very good chance that they will lose their opportunity to get their case dismissed. And they always have the possibility of incarceration hanging over their heads if they fuck up. And I don't think that we can heal people at gunpoint. So the sentiment behind it and the idea behind it is there's a lot of good stuff there, but I see it play out. I put a lot of my clients into this on this track because it's the best possible outcome within what we have. You do what you can with what you have, and it is often the best thing that we have within the options available to us. But I see really big flaws with it, and I see people who are first of all, doing the therapy, doing the treatment because they don't want to go to jail, validly so, but not because they actually want to do the therapy or want to do the treatment. My issues with the treatment itself are separate and could be a whole other podcast, but that's that's a whole other thing. So I think finding places and times and opportunities for people to feel safe to just explore why they're doing what they're doing, where it's coming from, but not at gunpoint, metaphorically speaking. Not, if you don't do this right now, if you don't do 52 Alcoholics Anonymous classes in a year, you're going to go to jail for 3 months, which is literally a situation many of my clients are in. So yeah, they're going to go to the fucking AAs, but that prospect fundamentally informs how they are going to be in those, meetings or whatever.
Yeah,
so
it changes the relationship to it.
And I think, and I don't know how we do this, but I think starting to, again, deconstruct the idea that in order for somebody to feel better, we need to punish them. And if we sort of unlearn that as a society, I think that there will just organically be more space for people to feel safe to heal on both sides. And that's what we want at the end of the day.
You talked about at the beginning of the podcast, the principles of punishment. Can you just, I don't know, talk more about that? Where do you feel this stuff comes from? And from my own angle and a little bit that I understand, I kind of look at it from a place of, human beings have an intrinsic relationship with debt. It seems like it's part of our wiring and our biology, where it's when somebody does something, we feel an obligation to return that favor, right? So we feel like a debt if somebody gives us a gift, even, right? Of I want to be good to them and that kind of thing after they do that. And the opposite, right? If we give a bunch, we kind of feel like somebody owes us. And there's a natural, there's actually a book called Debt. I forget who the author is, but he talks a lot about these examples from biology and into all of our social systems and the way that it's, it creates a lot of problems. And even if you look at the Bible, a big, process of what's going on there is the debt that comes with sort of sin, whether that's in the Christian Bible or it's in the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible, right? It's there's this intrinsic sense of I did something bad and then I need to something has to pay back that debt, and it makes sense even if you look at I forget what the exact it's the Code of Hammurabi or whatever, right? Where it's
Code of Hammurabi, eye for an eye.
Yeah, eye for an eye, right? And it's this it was a law that was here is what the retribution is, right? It's if you do this, this comes back, and it always seems like it was meant to be about property, if you will, right? It's it's meant to be about if I damage your shed, you need to give me your shed so that I have a shed. But then when you start doing damage that you can't really replace, right? You kill a child or you rape someone or whatever. It was they were trying to find some way to reconcile that debt somehow. But to your point, you have the eye for an eye thing, and the whole saying of an eye for an eye just makes two men blind, right? And it creates this circular problem that doesn't really solve anything. So I don't know. I've said a lot, but what's your take on the whole principles of punishment, the debt aspect that I just kind of mentioned, and how do we get out of that if we can?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I think that this principle of debt or reciprocity or whatever you want to call it, like I think that there was a time and space in our species evolution, culturally speaking, where that was probably the best thing we could do, and that was probably correct, in terms of like the knowledge that we had, where we were in our development, whatever, like in terms of our like collective consciousness. I think that there are a lot of things that for a time being actually amplify us and make us the best versions of ourselves, and then at a certain point when we don't move past it into the next thing, they start to handicap us and they regress us and they stagnate us. And I think that the principle of like an eye for an eye is a really great example of that. And I think that the same thing about like traditional gender roles, like there was a time when those were super helpful and necessary in our for our species. Like they weren't always this like intrinsically bad thing. There was a time when that was actually really important for our species to do well with the environment that we were in. And then there became a point, in my opinion, where they became more harmful than helpful to our species collectively. And we're at this point where there's a reluctance to move into whatever the next thing is. And I think eye for an eye reciprocity is a great example of that too, where we are now at a point where we can explore principles of like empathy and compassion and interconnectedness in this really cool way. And there's all of this this breadth of teachings and philosophy and spirituality where we can really kind of like pool our knowledge and resources together to understand that we can do something better now. I don't know what to call that next better thing except to say that additional harm doesn't undo previous harm, and it doesn't cancel it out. It just amplifies it, and it creates a cycle. Like you said, I think you said either cycle or circle. It creates this circular pattern that makes us just get stuck. And so I think kind of like I don't I'm not, and I think because of that perspective, like I'm not someone who's like, fuck that perspective. It's kind of like, no, let's be grateful for it. And then let's let it go and let's see what's next now, because we are now seeing that it is not serving us anymore. And when something isn't serving us collectively, I think we need as a species to learn how to let it go. And I think we have a really hard time with that because we have an attachment to it. And I kind of think that's where we're at right now. And as we start to detach from that organically, the next thing will sort of just happen if we can do that. And if we can't, we'll all just blow ourselves up and then whatever.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we don't do that, but
hopefully not, but yeah.
I mean, I think I loved what you said about like appreciating the past, essentially, right? Like talking about that as like a really important component of evolution in and of itself, right? Like I even think about what you're talking about with gender roles or these other parts of our lives collectively that have shifted, right? It really mirrors also our growth as an individual, right? Like as I grow up, right, there's a part of me that goes like especially for those of us who are raised with some level of trauma, which almost everybody is, right? It's like we grow up with patterns that served us at a point in our lives, and then that we get to a point in our life where that no longer serves us, and we have to untrain that behavior mechanism that we learned that is kind of capping at us at our knees at our new evolution and growth point. And I think I was just, I don't know, admiring the level of appreciation that you have for those things that I think are so often very easy to look past, right? Where it's like we don't give any credence or love. And I think also when we do that, we miss out on why those things were valuable and the lessons that they might have for us, even with our evolution, right? Like I think of something like gender roles of being like, oh, well, we're like, these traditional gender roles are bad versus like, well, what purpose did they serve? Well, like, how can we still have maybe the purpose and intent with those things and construct it in a new way that works in a more effective and new paradigm, right? Like understanding the value of like, if I know what my role is in a relationship, then I can focus on that, but my partner focuses on their thing, right? But if we are just like, well, neither of us are going to have roles and we don't talk about it at all, and we're just kind of running around by the seat of our pants, it can leave a lot of things undone, or there's not a collective level of teamwork that really happens in the relationship, right?
Totally.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm really grateful that you shared that because it gave me a lot of insight. Hope, this has
Yeah.
been. Oh, good. Do you want to say something?
No, I said thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Hope. Well, this has been a really fascinating and lovely conversation. I could talk to you for probably 8 more hours or something like that, and just keep
Same,
thinking with
dude.
you.
Always really,
Thanks.
really fun. And I'm glad that we had the space to do it here, that we didn't really have it like lightning in a bottle, because
Yeah.
it's lightning in a bottle. So
Yeah.
I'm really glad that
Yeah.
we got to expand here. It's
Yeah.
really, really cool. I'm really,
For
yeah,
sure. I agree.
yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I'll have you on again at some point. Well, I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about. And if do you have any, I guess, requests of the audience? Do you want to? I don't. You don't really do like a following on Instagram or anything, but do you have any? Where can people, I don't know, stay in touch with you or support something? Do you want to send them to a cause of some sort? Like, what would you? What's your ask of the
Oh
audience if they're still
no.
listening at this point?
Oh shit. So I'm not really super big on social media. I don't have that's not really I have a Instagram that I use to message people, but I don't really have like a
Sure.
platform or anything like that. I kind of
Hmm.
yeah, in terms of like a cause, I would send someone to.
Or just a request or an ask. Yeah.
Mm, I would say that the request I would have of people is the next time you see someone that instills or that like triggers some sort of like violent, vehement aversion, whether it's because of their existence or something that they said or did, um, or something that someone else said that they said or did. Next time you have that feeling kind of bubble up in you that encourages you to separate yourself and sort of dehumanize them, um, I would say like something I think we can all do better. I try my best to do this and I'm not always great at it, but when you have that feeling come up, like feel it, notice it, and then figure out why, and then figure out and think about three things or three perspectives that you can kind of internalize that give empathy to that person and that acknowledge their struggle that you may or may not know about, and that give space and kind of try to come to a place of love when you think about them after you've been triggered by them. I think that if we got into that practice, we would all be a lot better off.
Beautiful. Well, Hope, this was a lovely conversation, and I'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Hell yeah. Thanks, Cam. This was great.
My pleasure.